My name is Elena. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in environments where performance is measured in deadlines, deliverables, and how little trouble you cause for the people above you. I've been a project lead, an operations manager, a problem solver, the kind of person teams quietly rely on but rarely look at too closely. If you'd asked my colleagues to describe me back then, they would have said I was steady, calm, dependable, someone who didn't complain, someone who could handle pressure. What they really meant was that I absorbed pressure so others didn't have to. I wasn't loud. I didn't posture. I didn't play office politics well enough to be interesting. And because of that, I was underestimated in a very specific way. Not seen as weak exactly, but seen as safe to overload, safe to test limits on, safe to assign the work no one else wanted, and then quietly judge the outcome. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing anyone, humiliating a boss, or winning some dramatic courtroom victory. And it's not about me suddenly becoming fearless or outspoken overnight. It's about something quieter. It's about how failure can be designed, not accidental. How impossible deadlines can be assigned with full awareness that they cannot be met, right? And how criticism, when layered carefully on top of structural unfairness, becomes a tool of control. For a long time, I believed the problem was me, that I just needed to work harder, plan better, and sacrifice more. I internalized every missed expectation without ever questioning whether those expectations were meant to be met at all. This story follows the emotional journey of realizing that some systems don't reward effort, they extract it, that some authority figures don't want success, they want compliance, and that silence, when chosen consciously, can become something very different from submission. What you'll hear over the next hour or so is a first-person account of how I moved from invisibility to clarity, not through confrontation, not through drama, but through observation, documentation, and restraint, through understanding leverage instead of demanding fairness, through choosing dignity over explanation. There are no twirling mustaches here, no shouting matches, no miraculous turns of luck, just a slow shift in awareness, mine first and then much later theirs. I'm telling this story now because I know how common it is, especially for people who are competent, conscientious, and emotionally regulated. People who believe that if they just keep delivering, things will eventually balance out. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the imbalance is the point. So, before we go any further, let me ask you something. Gently, honestly, have you ever been criticized for failing at something that was never truly possible to succeed at in the first place? To them, I was reliable. That was the word that followed my name in meetings when I wasn't in the room. Reliable Elena, steady Elena, the one who keeps things moving. It sounded like praise, and for a long time, I treated it like it was. Reliability, I learned, is a double-edged thing. When you prove you can carry weight without complaint, people stop checking how heavy it is. In the office, I occupied a strange middle space. I wasn't junior enough to be openly dismissed, and I wasn't senior enough to be protected. I didn't interrupt. I didn't self-promote. I spoke when I had something concrete to say, and when decisions were made, I executed them cleanly. That combination made me useful and invisible. I wasn't underestimated in the obvious way. No one talked down to me. No one questioned my competence outright. Instead, my competence was assumed and then quietly exploited. If a project was behind, it landed on my desk. If a timeline was unrealistic, it became my responsibility to figure it out. If another department dropped the ball, I was looped in to catch it before leadership noticed. People trusted me not to escalate. They trusted me not to embarrass anyone. They trusted me to absorb chaos and return calm results. What they didn't do was ask whether the expectations made sense. In meetings, I was the one taking notes while others talked. Not because I was the assistant, I wasn't, but because no one else bothered. I tracked action items, dependencies, and risks. When something went wrong weeks later, I was the one who could explain exactly how and when it started drifting. That made me valuable. It also made me the default container for blame. My boss at the time liked to say I was unflappable. He said it like a compliment, but what it really meant was that he never saw me push back, never saw me say, "This isn't possible," never saw me ask for more time in a way that made him uncomfortable. I had learned early in my career that expressing strain often backfired. It marked you as difficult, emotional, not leadership material, so I kept my voice even. My emails are polite, my face is neutral. Inside, I told myself the story. This is how trust is built. This is how you earn influence. If I keep delivering, eventually the balance will correct itself. What I didn't realize then was that the role I was playing had already solidified in their minds. I wasn't seen as someone whose judgment needed to be consulted. I was seen as someone who could be handed problems after decisions were already made. I wasn't invited into early conversations. I was brought in at the point of execution, when options were gone and only outcomes mattered. And because I didn't resist, because I didn't dramatize the strain, because I always found a way, they assumed there always was one. I became the quiet proof that the system worked, even when it didn't. Looking back, the warning signs were subtle but consistent. Praise that never turned into protection, responsibility without authority, deadlines that tightened only after they reached my desk. At the time, I called it professionalism. I called it resilience. I called it paying my dues. I didn't yet have language for what it really was. The first time it happened, it was small enough that I almost dismissed it myself. It came in the form of a deadline, one that looked reasonable on paper, especially if you didn't understand the dependencies underneath it. The project had been floating between teams for weeks, stalled by unclear ownership and shifting priorities. When it finally landed with me, it arrived with a cheerful tone and a compressed timeline, as if momentum had simply been waiting for the right hands. "Can you turn this around by Friday?" my boss asked in our one-on-one, already glancing at his screen. It was Tuesday. I did the math in my head. Not just the hours, but the approvals required. The data I didn't control. The people who were already overloaded and slow to respond. I knew quietly, clearly, that Friday wasn't realistic. I hesitated, just a beat. "There are a few dependencies we'll need to lock down first," I said carefully. "If they move quickly, it's possible. But there are risks." He nodded, the way people do when they hear words but don't absorb meaning. "Let's aim for Friday," he said. "We'll need it for the leadership review." That was it. No discussion, no contingency, just a target set, clean and final. I left the meeting with that familiar sensation. Pressure settling in my chest. Not sharp enough to alarm me, just heavy enough to register. I opened my notebook and wrote down the date, the request, and the dependencies I'd flagged. It was a habit I'd developed without really knowing why. The week unfolded exactly as expected. One team delivered late. Another asked for clarifications that should have been addressed weeks earlier. I sent follow-ups. I documented responses. I worked late, not dramatically, just steadily. By Friday morning, I had something solid but incomplete. The core work was done. 2 approvals were still outstanding. I sent an update outlining what was finished, what was pending, and why. Clear, factual, no defensiveness. The reply came an hour later. "This isn't ready," my boss wrote. "We talked about having this done by today." I stared at the sentence longer than I should have. We had talked. I had flagged the risks. He had chosen the date anyway. I typed a response, then deleted it. Typed another, deleted that too. What I finally sent was short and neutral, an explanation of the outstanding approvals and when they were expected. There was no reply. In the following team meeting, the project came up briefly, not in detail, just enough to frame it. "We missed the window on that deliverable," my boss said, glancing in my direction and then away. "We'll need to tighten execution going forward." No names were mentioned, none were needed. No one questioned the timeline, no one asked what had changed. The moment passed, absorbed into the larger narrative of moving fast. I felt something then, not anger, not embarrassment, but a small, precise discomfort. Like a paper cut, you don't notice until you wash your hands. It wasn't the criticism itself, it was the quiet rewrite of events. The way my earlier warning had vanished from the story. The responsibility had been cleanly transferred without discussion. After the meeting, a colleague leaned over and whispered, "Rough one." I nodded, "Yeah." And that was it. No escalation, no correction, just a shared understanding that this was how things went. That night, I opened my notebook again and wrote one more line beneath the others. First missed deadline, risks noted in advance. I didn't know why I wrote it. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't angry enough to strategize. I just knew instinctively that I wanted the record to be accurate, even if no one else cared. That was the first small cut, not deep enough to bleed, but enough to teach me where the blade was. After that first deadline, nothing dramatic changed. And that was the problem. The pattern didn't arrive loudly. It settled in quietly, the way habits do. Another compressed timeline here. Another vague handoff there. Each one is justifiable on its own. Each one was small enough that pushing back felt disproportionate. I told myself I was being pragmatic. This quarter is just heavy. Leadership pressure is coming from above him. Everyone's stretched right now. Those explanations made it easier to stay quiet, easier to keep absorbing the impact without naming it. The deadlines became more aggressive, but only for certain projects, usually the ones that cross teams or involve fixing upstream mistakes, the kind of work that couldn't be scoped cleanly because it had already gone wrong before it reached me. And each time the same rhythm repeated. A request framed as a question, but delivered like a decision. A brief mention of urgency, never feasibility. A nod when I flagged risks, silence when those risks materialized. I learned to anticipate the criticism before it came. I'd brace myself for it, emotionally flattening my reactions so nothing showed on my face or in my voice. What surprised me wasn't that it kept happening. It was how quickly it started to feel normal. In meetings, I noticed how differently timelines were discussed depending on who owned the work. Some people negotiated openly, they pushed dates back, they asked for resources, their concerns were framed as strategic. When I raised concerns, they were framed as logistical. Can you just work around that? Is there a workaround? Let's not overcomplicate this. I wasn't being told no, I was being trained not to ask. The criticism when it came was always subtle, never harsh enough to challenge directly, never specific enough to refute easily. We need to be more proactive. This should have been anticipated. We can't keep missing expectations. Always we, always after the fact. I started doing more in advance, more documentation, more contingency planning, more unpaid mental labor to prevent outcomes that weren't fully in my control. I told myself this was growth, leadership thinking, owning the whole picture. What I didn't see was how the picture kept expanding, while my authority stayed the same. At some point, I stopped mentioning risks unless they were extreme. Not because they weren't real, but because mentioning them didn't change anything, and sometimes made things worse. There's a particular kind of disrespect that doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like being unheard and then judged as if you never spoke. That's the kind that sinks in quietly. I noticed how my boss would summarize my projects upward. The language shifted, complexity disappeared, dependencies flattened. By the time my work reached leadership, it sounded simpler, and my delays sounded personal. Execution issue, timing misalignment, resource management opportunity. I was being described, not consulted, and still I stayed. Part of me believed that if I just held steady long enough, someone would notice the pattern. That fairness eventually would assert itself. Another part of me was afraid of being labeled difficult, afraid of losing the reputation I'd built, afraid that if I pushed back and failed, I'd have nothing left to stand on. So I normalized it. I adjusted my expectations downward. I stopped expecting acknowledgement. I stopped expecting protection. I even stopped expecting clarity. I focused on deliverables, on being useful, on staying composed. From the outside, I looked like someone handling pressure well. From the inside, something was eroding. Not my confidence exactly, but my sense of proportion. I was losing track of what was reasonable to expect from a system versus what I was expected to absorb. The disrespect didn't escalate, it stabilized. And that stability was what made it dangerous. Because once something becomes normal, you stop questioning it. You stop measuring it against what should be fair. You start measuring yourself instead. I didn't realize it then, but I had crossed an invisible line from being a professional navigating difficulty to being a buffer others relied on so they wouldn't have to feel it. And buffers aren't meant to last forever. I didn't wake up one day and realize I had been assigned a role. It revealed itself gradually, in the way people spoke to me, in the assumptions they made without checking, in the work that arrived on my desk already shaped by decisions I hadn't been part of. I was the fixer, not the architect, not the decision maker, the person you involve once things are already in motion and can't be stopped. I noticed it most clearly during a planning cycle. Leadership met for days, mapping strategy, aligning priorities, setting ambitious targets. I wasn't invited. That wasn't unusual. My role wasn't strategic on paper. What was unusual was what happened afterward. 3 major initiatives landed with me within 48 hours. Each one had aggressive timelines. Each one depended on resources I didn't control. Each one had already been promised upward. When I asked for context, I got summaries. When I asked for flexibility, I got encouragement. "You're great at navigating complexity," my boss said. We trust you to make it work. Trust. Another word that sounded good and meant something else entirely. I wasn't being trusted with authority. I was being trusted not to resist. The role became clearer every time something went wrong. I was the point of explanation, the person expected to justify delays, smooth friction, and manage disappointment, often without being given the power to prevent those outcomes in the first place. I wasn't in the room when the scope expanded. I wasn't in the room when deadlines were promised, but I was always in the room when results were evaluated. That's when I started to understand the shape of the role: reliable, useful, invisible. Reliable enough that my workload could expand without question. Useful enough that saying no felt like a betrayal. Invisible enough that my perspective could be excluded without consequence. The role wasn't maliciously designed. That's important to say. No one sat down and decided to exploit me. But once the pattern proved effective, it didn't need intention anymore. Systems, once established, perpetuate themselves. I began to notice how often phrases like, "Elena will handle it," appeared in conversations I wasn't part of. How often were decisions framed as already solved by the time they reached me? I also noticed how rarely anyone asked whether the workload was sustainable. That question, I realized, was never going to come from above. There was a moment, small, forgettable to anyone else, when this crystallized. My boss forwarded me an email chain with leadership. At the bottom was a commitment I hadn't seen before, tied to a deadline I hadn't agreed to. He added a single line: FYI, looping you in, looping me in, after the promise, after the date, after the expectations were set. That was the role. I felt something settle then, not anger, recognition. This wasn't about one unfair deadline or one dismissive comment. It was about how my consistency had been interpreted, not as a sign of judgment, but as a guarantee of compliance. I had been cast as the person who absorbs risk, so others can appear decisive. And because I had never refused the role, it had become mine by default. The hardest part was accepting that no one was going to correct this for me. There would be no sudden realization from leadership, no apology, no course correction. The system was working as designed, just not for me. I didn't change anything yet, not outwardly, but internally something shifted. I stopped asking, "How do I meet these expectations?" and started asking, "Why do these expectations exist, and who do they actually serve?" That question didn't make me louder. It made me quieter and far more attentive. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voices, no moment where I finally stood up for myself. If you had watched it happen, you wouldn't have noticed anything at all. It was a Tuesday. Ordinary, overcast. The kind of day that blends into every other workday when you're not expecting anything to change. I was sitting in a small conference room, waiting for a meeting that was already 10 minutes late. On the table in front of me was a printed project plan, one I had revised 3 times in the past week to account for changes that kept arriving without warning. As I waited, I reread the timeline. Not to memorize it, to see it. I followed the dates with my finger. The dependencies, the approval gates were still unresolved. The milestones that had been moved earlier without explanation. And for the first time, I didn't ask myself how I could make it work. I asked myself whether it was ever meant to. That question landed differently than the others I'd asked before. It didn't come with anxiety attached. It came with calm. I realized something unsettling and clarifying all at once. The deadlines weren't optimistic. They weren't ambitious. They were performative. They existed to signal decisiveness upward, not to guide execution downward. Whether they were met was secondary. What mattered was that someone could be held responsible if they weren't, and that someone consistently was me. The meeting eventually started. People filed in, apologizing lightly. We walked through the agenda. I spoke when spoken to. I answered questions. I made no objections. But internally, I had stepped back. I wasn't dissociating. I was observing. I noticed how often my boss spoke about constraints instead of addressing them, how he reframed systemic delays as individual performance issues, how quickly responsibility shifted when things became uncomfortable. I noticed, too, how calm I felt. Not numb, clear. For years, I had been trying to solve a problem that wasn't mine to solve. I had been internalizing failure that was structurally inevitable. That realization didn't make me angry. It relieved me. Because if failure was designed, not accidental, then my worth was never actually in question. The meeting ended. Everyone left. I stayed seated for a moment longer, looking at the empty chairs. I closed my notebook, slowly And in that quiet room, I made a private decision. Not a plan, not an ultimatum. A boundary, internal, invisible. I would stop compensating for broken structures. I would stop translating chaos into calm at my own expense. I would stop volunteering my nervous system as a buffer. Outwardly, nothing changed that day. I sent the same kinds of emails. I attended the same meetings. I met the same expectations on paper. But something fundamental had shifted in how I related to all of it. I no longer believed the story I'd been telling myself, that if I just worked harder, things would balance out. I understood now that balance wasn't coming from effort. It would only come from clarity, and clarity doesn't announce itself. It waits. That was the day silence stopped being something I endured and became something I chose. After that Tuesday, my silence changed texture. From the outside, it looked exactly the same. I still didn't interrupt. I still didn't push back in meetings. I still spoke in measured tones and sent carefully worded emails. But internally, silence was no longer a reflex, it was a decision. Before, my quiet had been rooted in hope that things would improve, that fairness would emerge if I stayed composed long enough. Now, my quiet was rooted in assessment. I stopped trying to correct the narrative in real time. Not because I couldn't, but because I was watching how the narrative functioned. When deadlines were assigned, I asked clarifying questions, nothing more. I documented answers. When timelines shifted without discussion, I noted the date and the source. When approvals stalled, I recorded who held them and for how long. I didn't escalate, I didn't complain, I didn't warn. And because of that, people assumed nothing had changed. My boss in particular seemed relieved. I was still handling things, still dependable, still not causing friction. What he didn't realize was that I had stopped absorbing uncertainty. If a dependency wasn't resolved, I didn't quietly compensate for it anymore. I let it remain visible. Without commentary, without emotion, I delivered what was possible within the constraints as stated, nothing extra. This is where silence is often misunderstood. People think silence is passive. That means agreement or fear. But there's a different kind of silence, the kind that withholds labor, not speech, the kind that stops smoothing over gaps that others benefit from ignoring. I watched how quickly assumptions filled the space I no longer occupied. When a deliverable slipped, the room felt confused, not accusatory at first. They weren't used to seeing friction without me preemptively resolving it. My boss started asking questions later in the process. "What's blocking this?" he'd say, as if the answer hadn't been on the project plan for weeks. I'd respond calmly, "We're waiting on approval from X." No apology, no urgency, just a fact. He'd nod, unsettled, and say, "Okay, let's follow up," which I had already done and documented. Others mistook my composure for weakness. I could feel it in the way people spoke around me, in the subtle shift of tone. They assumed I was disengaging, burning out, losing edge. I let them. There's a power in allowing misinterpretation when you no longer need to correct it. I was no longer trying to be seen as exceptional. I was letting the system show itself, unaltered by my constant adjustments. And something interesting began to happen. Without my invisible labor, the cracks became harder to ignore. Meetings ran longer. Decisions stalled. Small delays compounded. No one blamed me outright, not yet, but the comfort they had relied on, the sense that someone would quietly make it work, was gone. And still I said nothing, not because I didn't care, but because I finally cared about the right things. I was conserving energy, gathering information, letting patterns complete themselves. Silence, I learned, isn't empty. It's a container, and once you stop filling it for others, they start to notice what's missing. While everyone was adjusting, awkwardly, to the absence of my quiet overcompensation, I was preparing, not dramatically, not in secret meetings or late-night plotting, just steadily, methodically, in the same way I'd always worked, only now with a different purpose. What they never noticed was how much I already knew. For years, I had been the connective tissue between teams. I understood not just what was happening, but why. I knew which approvals always stalled, which departments overpromised, which metrics leadership actually cared about versus the ones they talked about publicly. I had timelines, email threads, decision histories. None of it was confidential in the sensational sense. It was just complete. While others focused on optics, I focused on systems. And systems, when documented, tell very clear stories. I began organizing my notes more deliberately, not just recording events, but mapping patterns. How long approvals actually took. How often has the scope changed after commitments were made? How frequently were deadlines set before inputs were secured? I didn't share this analysis with anyone. There was no audience for it yet. Instead, I asked myself practical questions. If I were removed from this process tomorrow, what would break? If someone had to justify these timelines externally, what would they rely on? If accountability were traced honestly, where would it land? The answers weren't flattering to leadership. I also started paying attention to policy, company guidelines I'd skimmed before but never needed to rely on, performance frameworks, risk management language, escalation protocols. Not to weaponize them, to understand them. Most people treat policy as theoretical. I treated it as architecture. And architecture, once you understand it, shows you where weight can and can't be placed. I noticed how often my role blurred the lines that policies were designed to keep distinct, how responsibility had been assigned without authority, how expectations had been set without a documented agreement. None of this was illegal, but it was fragile. At the same time, I was quietly repositioning myself. I stopped volunteering for work that wasn't mine. I declined meetings where my presence was habitual, not necessary. When asked to just take a look, I asked what decision was actually being made. This wasn't resistance, it was precision. People adjusted. Some were irritated, some barely noticed. The system absorbed the change the way it always had, by leaning elsewhere, by stretching. What they didn't see was that I was no longer woven into it the same way. I was making myself legible, not louder, clearer. I also started conversations outside the immediate chain of command. No complaints, context, neutral explanations of how work actually flowed. Questions about expectations, ownership, and decision rights. I listened more than I spoke. Those conversations didn't change anything immediately, but they changed how others understood my role, slowly, quietly. The most important preparation wasn't external, though. It was internal. I let go of the need to be perceived as good, or helpful, or indispensable. I focused instead on being accurate. Accuracy has a gravity to it. It doesn't rush, it doesn't plead, it just accumulates. And the longer I stayed calm, the more obvious the misalignment became. Not because I pointed it out, but because I stopped correcting for it. They never noticed when I stopped being the buffer. They only noticed when the system started asking harder questions, and there was no one left to answer them on my behalf. The reveal didn't come from a conversation. It came from a document. I was reviewing an internal planning file one evening, something I'd looked at dozens of times before, when I noticed a small discrepancy. A date that didn't align, a dependency listed as confirmed that, according to every email and meeting note I had been. I cross-checked it. Then again, what I found wasn't explosive. It wasn't a scandal. It was something far more useful. Proof. Proof that timelines were being finalized and presented upward as resolved before critical approvals existed. Proof that risk had been acknowledged internally, then quietly erased in summary documents. Proof that delivery expectations were being set in a vacuum, and then enforced as if they had been collaborative. I felt no rush of adrenaline, no urge to screenshot or forward anything. Just a deep, settling clarity. This wasn't about my performance, it had been. The failure was designed, not to punish me, but to protect the narrative of decisiveness above me. I gathered what I already had: my notes, my emails, the documented risks I'd flagged, and the responses I'd received. I laid them out chronologically. The story they told was clean. Warnings given, risks acknowledged, commitments made anyway, responsibility reassigned afterward. What struck me most was how consistent it was. Not malicious, efficient. This wasn't a person problem, it was a structural problem. And structures don't respond to emotion, they respond to alignment, or the lack of it. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. There was no benefit in that yet. Instead, I asked myself a single grounding question. What do I want to be true 6 months from now? Not revenge, not validation. Stability, dignity, accuracy. I didn't want to keep operating inside a system that required me to absorb distortion to function. And I didn't want to burn it down either. I wanted out cleanly. That meant patience. It meant understanding exactly where my leverage existed and where it didn't. It meant knowing which conversations mattered and which didn't. Most of all, it meant accepting something uncomfortable. Once you see clearly, you can't unsee. And you can't keep pretending without paying a psychological cost. That evening, I closed my laptop and sat quietly for a long time. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph, just relief. Relief at knowing I wasn't imagining things. relief at having proof that my intuition had been accurate, relief at realizing I didn't need to convince anyone to understand what was happening. I only needed to decide what to do with that understanding. And that decision was coming. Clarity narrows your options. That's something no one tells you. We like to think that understanding creates freedom, but in reality, it removes illusion. And with it, many of the paths you once believed were viable. Once I saw the system clearly, I knew I couldn't go back to managing it the way I had before. I also knew that confronting it directly, demanding fairness, presenting evidence, forcing acknowledgement, would only trigger defense. The structure wasn't built to hear me. It was built to move past discomfort. So I laid out my options carefully. I could stay and continue operating as the buffer, now with full awareness of the cost. That would buy short-term stability and long-term erosion. I could escalate formally, pushing documentation upward and insisting on structural change. That path required energy I didn't have, and would likely end with my role being reframed as the problem. Or I could exit, quietly, intentionally on my terms. Not abruptly, not emotionally. Strategically. That third option was the irreversible one. Leaving didn't mean quitting in protest. It meant repositioning myself so that my absence would speak more clearly than any argument. It meant preparing the ground, so I wouldn't be forced into explanations or counter-narratives, so I wouldn't be framed as disengaged or overwhelmed. I needed my departure to be legible, rational, unavoidable, and that meant timing. I began aligning my work with my job description. Nothing more, nothing less. I ensured transitions were documented. I clarified ownership. I removed myself from being the informal catch-all. At the same time, I started exploring opportunities elsewhere. Quiet conversations, careful research, no urgency. I wasn't running, I was selecting. The decision settled slowly, like sediment. Each day made it more obvious that staying would require me to keep distorting myself to fit a system that didn't want to change. I didn't resent my boss, or the company, or even the role. I simply recognized that my continued presence was enabling a design that required someone like me to fail, softly, repeatedly, so others could appear successful. I wasn't willing to do that anymore. The moment the decision became real wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet sense of finality, the kind that doesn't need to be shared. From that point on, everything I did had a different orientation. Not toward fixing the system, but toward leaving it intact enough that my exit would reveal its shape. That was the choice. Once made, it couldn't be undone. After the decision, I moved carefully, not cautiously, deliberately. There's a difference. I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint. I didn't emotionally detach in ways that would raise concern. I stayed consistent, professional, and present. But everything I did now served a single purpose: clean separation. I stopped being the informal bridge between teams. If someone needed clarity, I directed them to the documented owner. If a decision hadn't been made, I didn't make it for them. I documented transitions with more precision than before. Clear scopes, clear boundaries, clear timelines that reflected reality, not aspiration. No dramatics, no commentary. This had an interesting effect. Because the system had relied on my flexibility, my precision felt like resistance, even though it wasn't. Deadlines started to slip in visible ways. Questions surfaced later than they should have. My boss grew restless. He checked in more frequently, asked if I was doing okay. I reassured him calmly. I was meeting expectations, just no longer exceeding them invisibly. At the same time, I continued conversations outside the immediate hierarchy. References, future teams, roles that valued judgment, not just output. I was careful with timing. I didn't want overlap. I didn't want counteroffers. I didn't want to be convinced to stay. When the offer came, it felt quiet, solid, aligned. I accepted it without celebration. Then came the final step, choosing when to speak. I waited until my current projects were in stable phases. Not because I owed the system anything, but because clarity is most powerful when it's unassailable. When I finally told my boss, I did it in a one-on-one. Calm, direct, no build-up. I've accepted another role, I said. I'll give full notice and document transitions. He looked surprised, not shocked, confused. Can I ask why, he said. I paused, not to strategize. To be honest, without over-explaining, I'm looking for an environment where planning and execution are more closely aligned, I said. That was all. No accusations, no stories, no defense. He nodded slowly, processing. Word spread, as it always does. Quietly at first, then with more attention. People started asking questions about timelines, ownership, things I'd previously handled without comment. I answered what I could, pointed to documentation, stayed calm. And still, no one fully understood what was happening. They just knew something essential was shifting, and they hadn't seen it coming. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded the way structural problems always do, slowly at first, then all together. In my final weeks, I noticed how often my name came up in meetings I was no longer leading. People referenced things I used to manage instinctively, decisions I used to translate, risks I used to quietly absorb. Without that buffer, small inefficiencies became visible. Approvals stalled longer, timelines conflicted, meetings ended without resolution. None of this was catastrophic, but it was persistent. My boss started joining more working sessions, not to lead, just to understand. I could see the strain in his questions, the way he circled issues without quite naming them. "Why is this taking so long?" he asked once, genuinely puzzled. No one answered immediately, because the answer wasn't simple. It wasn't a person. It was the accumulation of shortcuts, assumptions, and deferred responsibility that had worked, until I stopped compensating for them. Colleagues began to feel exposed, not blamed, just more accountable. They had to articulate constraints they'd never needed to before. They had to defend timelines they hadn't fully considered. Some grew defensive, others grew quiet. I stayed steady. I didn't say, "This is what I was handling." I didn't say, "This is why it was hard." I just completed my transitions, shared my documentation, answered questions factually. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative began to shift, not toward blame, but toward uncertainty. Leadership wanted to know where the friction was coming from. Why did execution feel harder? Why things that had once seemed manageable now required more discussion? No one said my name in those conversations. They didn't need to. My absence was doing the explaining. In my final week, my boss asked for another one-on-one. "I didn't realize how much you were holding together," he said, not defensively, just tired. I listened. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't fully owning it either. But he was seeing something he hadn't before. And that was enough, because this wasn't about recognition. It was about accuracy. The system was finally encountering itself without distortion, and it didn't like what it saw. I left without a scene, without speeches, without loose ends, just a handshake, a thank you, a closed laptop, and the quiet certainty that what followed would no longer involve me. After I left, I heard things secondhand, not gossip, just fragments, messages from former colleagues, careful check-ins that revealed more than they intended. They were trying to fix it. Processes were being reviewed, timelines questioned, roles clarified, meetings added, more of them longer ones. It was all very serious, very urgent, and very late. What they were attempting now required trust, alignment, and honest reckoning. The very things the system had learned to bypass by leaning on my silence. Without a buffer, the cost of those shortcuts became visible. And visibility doesn't automatically create change. Sometimes it just creates panic. My boss reached out once more, not to ask me back, to ask questions. "How did you usually manage these overlaps? What would you prioritize if everything was urgent? Do you think we set unrealistic expectations?" I answered neutrally, carefully, as someone no longer inside the frame. "I focused on sequencing," I said. "I worked with what was controllable. Expectations matter as much as capacity." He thanked me. I could hear the regret underneath. Not personal, but systemic. The realization that something functional had been misunderstood as effortless. They tried to redistribute my responsibilities, but they weren't discrete tasks. They were connective judgments. Context, memory. You can't divide that cleanly. Some people burned out quickly. Others pushed back earlier than I ever had. Deadlines were renegotiated, not because the environment had become kinder, but because it had become undeniable. The irony was quiet and sharp. The same constraints I'd flagged for years were now being discussed openly, just without me in the room. There was a brief window where things might have shifted if the system had been willing to slow down earlier, to listen, to adjust. But systems that rely on invisibility rarely self-correct until the cost becomes unavoidable. By then, the original contributors are usually gone. I felt no satisfaction hearing any of this, only distance, because the lesson wasn't for them anymore. It was for me. I had learned the difference between being valued and being used, between trust and dependency, between silence that protects and silence that erases. And I had chosen quietly, deliberately, not to be erased. The final confrontation didn't happen when I expected it to. It wasn't during my notice period, not in my last week, not even in the immediate aftermath of my departure, when confusion was still raw and everyone was scrambling to reassign work. It came months later, after the system had enough time to experience itself without me. The call came on an ordinary afternoon, an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, then decided not to. It was my former boss. His voice was careful, not formal, but not casual either, as if he hadn't fully decided what tone was appropriate. "Do you have a few minutes?" he asked. I did. What struck me first was how unhurried he sounded. There was no agenda being pushed, no outcome he was steering toward. Just need to say something, finally, without the pressure of immediate consequence. He didn't start with apologies. He started with context. He talked about how things had unfolded after I left, about the delays that kept surfacing, about the friction leadership was suddenly noticing, about how often my name came up, not in blame but in absence. "I didn't realize how much judgment you were exercising every day," he said. "I thought the work was just getting done." I listened without reacting, without correcting. Then he said something that mattered. "I think I assigned you deadlines that were never realistic," he said. "And then I evaluated you as if they were." The sentence hung there, clean, unembellished. That was the moment I knew this conversation was different. He wasn't confessing guilt, he was acknowledging design. He went on, slower now. He spoke about pressure from above, about how decisiveness was rewarded, about how risks were supposed to be managed downstream, quietly. "I see now that I kept pushing problems into your lane because you never let them explode," he said, and I took that as proof that the approach worked. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't rush to reassure him that he'd done his best. When he finished, there was a pause. "I wish you'd told me how bad it was," he said, not accusing, just honest. That was the only moment where I felt the weight of all the years compress into a single response. And still, I didn't raise my voice. "I did tell you," I said calmly. "I flagged risks, I documented constraints, I asked for sequencing instead of compression." Another pause. "But I also understand," I continued. "Those signals didn't register because acknowledging them would have required changing how success was being measured." He exhaled, slowly. "I think I set you up to fail," he said again, this time without hesitation. I didn't say it was okay. I didn't say it wasn't his fault. "I don't think it was intentional," I said, "but it was structural, and once something is structural, individual effort can't fix it." That was the confrontation. No heat, no accusations, no emotional unloading. Just two people naming the same reality from opposite sides of it. He thanked me for my work, for my restraint, for the way I exited without burning bridges. What he didn't say, but didn't need to, was that the system had finally become more expensive than convenient. When we ended the call, I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Finished explaining. Finished hoping for recognition. Finished carrying a story that was never mine to carry. The confrontation hadn't given me closure. It confirmed that I no longer needed it. I didn't leave that job as a transformed person in the dramatic sense. There was no reinvention montage, no sudden confidence, no urge to rewrite my personality to prove something to anyone. What changed was quieter and far more durable. I became someone who no longer confuses endurance with value. For a long time, I believed that being calm under pressure was my greatest strength. And it is, but only when that calm isn't being exploited. I now understand that resilience without boundaries doesn't make you strong. It makes it convenient. In my new role, my work looks different. Not because I work harder or softer, but because I work accurately. When timelines are discussed, feasibility is part of the conversation. When risks exist, they're named early, not buried. When something isn't possible, that truth is allowed to stand without being smoothed over. And when it isn't, I don't compensate for it anymore. I don't volunteer my nervous system as infrastructure. What surprises people now is not my competence, but my clarity. I ask fewer questions, but they're sharper. I speak less often, but earlier. I don't rush to reassure. I let discomfort surface where it belongs. I'm still calm, still composed, still reliable. But I'm no longer invisible. The biggest shift, though, isn't professional, it's internal. I don't personalize structural failure anymore. I don't assume that pressure is proof of importance, or that being stretched thin means I'm doing something right. I pay attention to patterns instead of promises. I watch how responsibility moves when things get hard. I notice who absorbs consequences and who never does. And when I see a system quietly designing failure for someone else, I don't rush in to save it. I name it, or I step away. There's a kind of peace that comes from no longer needing to be seen as the good one, the dependable one, the one who never makes things difficult. I let myself be accurate instead. Looking back, I don't regret staying as long as I did. That time taught me discernment. It taught me how systems really work, not in theory, but in practice. It also taught me this: quiet people are often carrying far more than anyone realizes. And when they stop, it isn't because they couldn't handle it. It's because they finally understood they shouldn't have to. I didn't leave with bitterness, I left with alignment. And alignment, once you've experienced it, changes how you move through everything. You stop negotiating with distortion. You stop explaining what's obvious. You stop performing stability for systems that depend on imbalance. You become still, and from that stillness, you choose where your effort belongs. That's who I am now. There's a lesson people often want from stories like this. They want tactics, scripts, the right moment to speak up, the perfect sentence that finally makes someone listen. But this story isn't about finding better words. It's about recognizing when words were never the problem. Some systems don't fail because people don't try hard enough. They fail because they are built to move responsibility downward and recognition upward, because they reward speed over truth, because they rely on a certain kind of person to absorb the cost quietly. If you are calm, capable, and conscientious, that person is often you. And if you stay long enough, you may start to believe that the strain you feel is a personal shortcoming, that you're not organized enough, assertive enough, efficient enough. This story is a reminder that sometimes failure isn't feedback. It's architecture. When impossible deadlines are assigned and then used as evidence of your inadequacy, the goal was never success. It was compliance, predictability, silence. The reversal doesn't come from confrontation. It doesn't come from proving them wrong. It comes from clarity, from understanding where responsibility ends and distortion begins, from seeing when your effort is propping up a system that has no incentive to change, as long as you keep compensating for it. Quiet dominance isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't humiliate anyone. It simply withdraws support from what no longer deserves it and redirects that energy toward alignment. There are no villains in this story, just people operating inside incentives they didn't design, and one person who chose to stop absorbing the cost of those incentives. If you take anything from this, let it be this: you don't need permission to stop carrying what was never meant to be yours. You don't need validation to trust what you can already see. And you don't need to explain your clarity to people who benefit from your confusion. Sometimes the most powerful move is not to fight harder, but to step aside and let the structure reveal itself. I'm curious, quietly, genuinely, have you ever realized a little too late that what you were being judged for was something no one could have succeeded at to begin with?